Stephen Smith and myself talk Alabama football each and every Wednesday night. You can join us live as we send out the link on Twitter, or just go to MarkRogersTV every Wednesday night right around 6:45 Eastern time. We're talking Alabama football. You can see the complete conversation there. We also post it to iTunes and Podbean if you just want to hear the audio at Mark Rogers TV, or if you're just interested in individual topics, we break that down for you and make that available by Thursday at Mark Rogers TV. So, of course, Stephen, you broke down the last wave. I'm going to give you a little bit of an assignment, homework assignment for the next few weeks that you'll probably not need any homework on because you know this football team too well, but we'll probably need to look back at some point during the summer, getting us ready for August camp, and look at this 2017 class in regards to who you think can make an immediate impact, who are some sleepers, and kind of square up the class for us.
No problem at all. I'm excited to do it.
All right. The SEC coaches each and every year, right around Memorial Day, convene on Florida and get together to talk about the topics that affect the SEC in particular, but all of college football as well. Nick Saban made a comment this week about Florida State possibly being the preseason #1 team in the land. We know, regardless of what the rankings are going to be, it's going to be one of the great and much anticipated games, the anticipated game of week 1. Ed Orgeron of LSU. Of course, the Tigers have generally been the foe, the team in the way of Alabama since Nick Saban left and Les Miles took over. And that was quite a battle for a number of years. The Tide has dominated in recent years, and not necessarily on the scoreboard and crushing LSU, but being the better team and winning those battles 10-0 this past year in Baton Rouge. But Ed Orgeron knows his task and knows that the LSU faithful want to get back on top of the SEC Western Division. And if you can get on top of that division, you're playing for a college football playoff berth, of course. Orgeron making comments this week about needing to get back in the driver's seat in recruiting. Now, nothing is wrong with LSU's recruiting, typically a top 5 class in the land, but maybe that they need to reel in a couple more to get ahead of Alabama and chase down the Tide, Stephen.
I think what Orgeron was trying to say there, Mark, is keeping the in-state talent in-state. Let's make no mistake about it. Louisiana, that Texas, Louisiana area is a hotbed in recruiting. And I go back to 2009 for just a moment, remembering guys like Robbie Green and Eddie Lacy and Kenny Bell. Those were the first 3 players that from that Louisiana area, but Alabama went in, plucked them out, brought them to Alabama. Since then, we've seen Bradley Silv and Landon Collins, Cam Robinson, and Cam Sims, just so many times since the early part of Saban in Alabama. Since then, the Crimson Tide able to go into the Bayou and take guys right out of LSU's backyard. And the fan base of the Tigers know that the quickest way to keep these guys in our backyard is to win. Kids want to go to programs that win and that win championships and that win consistently. And Orgeron made a comment that that's the benchmark. You have to beat Alabama. That's the benchmark. You have to win the SEC, and you have to compete for a national championship. And one of the more crucial things for the Tigers is getting a quarterback that really forces defensive coordinators to scheme and game plan to play that type of a quarterback. The last time the Tigers had a Satan O'Connor that really struck fear in the hearts of opponents with his dynamic play was Jamarcus Russell back in the early 2000s. He was the last one, both throwing and running the football. Now, Zach Mettenberger, from a throwing standpoint, was good. You know, Matt Flynn won a national championship with the Tigers as a 2-loss LSU team back in 2007. Matt Flynn was decent. You had guys like Jarrett Lee and Jordan Jefferson that were okay, but average. And then you had Ryan Perrilloux, who played with Matt Flynn, who was supposed to have been the big-time heir apparent, but Ryan Perrilloux got dismissed from the program. And then there's Anthony Jennings, and Brandon Harris that both ended up transferring. So since Jamarcus Russell, you haven't had that quarterback that made defenses go, holy cow, how are we going to defend this guy? Is there any way we can rattle this young man? There's not been a quarterback at LSU since Jamarcus Russell that has planted that thought in the minds of defensive coordinators. And until that happens, it's going to constantly be a struggle for LSU. They recruit well at running back. You saw Leonard Fournette. We've seen Spencer Ware. We've seen Charles Scott. We've seen Joseph Adai and Justin Benson and just the plethora of running backs the Tigers have brought in. We've seen them at receiver with Ernie Doucette, Dwayne Bowe, of course, Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry, Malachi Dupree, Trayvon Durrell. Defensively, LSU keeps strong talent on the defensive line. It keeps talent at linebacker. It keeps talent in the secondary. The Tigers even find a way on special teams to get good kickers and punters, but it comes back to the quarterback, the signal caller, the one calling the shots. When will LSU get a quarterback that dominates that forces, I should say, defenders to really play that particular position? Until LSU gets that, it's going to be a struggle in the Bayou.
Stephen, you bring up 2011, or you bring up Jordan Jefferson, and I instantly go back to 2011 because we've had the discussion that season was almost the breaking point where Alabama broke away from LSU and left them in second or third place in the SEC West permanently. For several seasons there leading up to that campaign, the programs were juggernauts, step for step for the most part. And LSU wins the game in Tuscaloosa, the 9-6 game in overtime. Bama completely outclasses them 21-0 in the national championship game. For me, because of two reasons. One, because A.J. McCarron was far more the more efficient quarterback. Jordan Jefferson just did not have grasp of the offense, didn't threat the defense with a significant passing game, was too erratic throwing the ball downfield, and just the difference, for all credit given to Les Miles for inspiring football teams, getting great recruiting classes, and really developing the players for the most part in a game-for-game situation in terms of X's and O's strategy versus Nick Saban. I think it was a mismatch. You give Saban a month against Les Miles, and that was the result, 21-0. Since then, LSU is bringing in top 5 talent, but they have not been able to hang with the Tide. I haven't run the numbers, but I would guess, Stephen, that in the last, probably since Urban Meyer came to Ohio State, that Alabama, Ohio State, Florida State, and LSU have a significant gap over the rest of the country in bringing in top talent. Of course, the Tide, according to most services, has brought in, 7 or 8 consecutive number 1 classes. Ohio State had a class this year that could arguably be called the best in the nation. But the one distinguishing point is that Ohio State's moved on quarterbacks to the NFL. Cardell Jones and J.T. Barrett had a couple great seasons. We'll see what he does at the next level. Florida State, of course, had Jameis Winston and now DeAndre Francois. You went down the litany of quarterbacks at LSU since winning a national championship and since Jamarcus Russell was the number 1 overall pick in the draft, and there just hasn't been a comparison with what the other programs have churned out just at that one position. Otherwise, LSU has been just as good as anyone, you would think. At least the recruiting rankings would tell us that going into college, and then the NFL draft picks would signify that they've been just as good as just about anybody else when the players come out at the other end of the system 3 or 4 years later.
LSU has recruited well. LSU has recruited very well. And this is a program where I think the fan base is screaming, when will the recruiting classes turn in to championships? When will the recruiting classes turn into us consistently beating Alabama, consistently beating other teams in the SEC, consistently competing for national championships? Ed Orgeron knows what he's up against. Ed Orgeron knows what the task is set out in front of him. But I continue to reiterate, it starts with that quarterback. It starts with that guy who's got the confidence to not only lead a team, but also the throwing mechanics, the throwing prowess to put that team on his back. Or should he be a dual threat quarterback? The dual threat prowess to put that team on his back and carry that team to the promised land. And until that happens, or until LSU develops a scheme where it's quarterback friendly, it's going to be difficult because I even go back to last year prior to Les Miles being fired. They had a 5-star receiver to come into LSU, a 5-star receiver, and he ended up transferring out of the program. And the reason why he transferred, and I quote, he transferred because the offense just wasn't open enough. The offense just was not receiver friendly enough. Guys were not getting the ball because Les Miles was so prone on running the ball with Leonard Fournette. Run the ball, Leonard Fournette. Run the ball, Leonard Fournette. Leonard Fournette is an incredible running back, but unless you have a passing game to really complement him, or any back for that matter, your running back's going to get banged up, bruised up going into the National Football League because you don't have a quarterback to take some pressure off of him and force defenses to recognize, whoa, this is not one-dimensional. They got a two-dimensional system going.
And, Stephen, as we discussed before we came on, looking back at the LSU teams over the last decade, unfortunately for them, when they put together the best group of skill position players that they've had since Jamarcus Russell and that gang, it was Zach Mettenberger at quarterback. And even though he didn't threaten the defense with his legs, obviously an NFL type of passer, Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham Jr. on the outside, Jeremy Hill in the backfield, who's starting with the Cincinnati Bengals, a tremendous offensive cast. But unfortunately for Les Miles and crew in 2013, that's probably the weakest, and this is LSU week, relatively speaking, weakest core of defensive talent and offensive line talent that they've had roughly in the last decade was that particular season. I think they lost 38-17 in Tuscaloosa that particular year. One more note on LSU before we move on to another chief rival of the Tide is that I had an interview with Adrian Ely, an offensive tackle out of Louisiana. And to your point, he was down to Oklahoma and LSU because of the excitement of the Oklahoma offense. He thought he could showcase his wares as a left tackle in space in the passing attack at Oklahoma and move it on to the NFL as opposed to grind it out at LSU and not really showcase his game for NFL scouts. So it came down to a top player at tackle choosing Oklahoma over LSU this past recruiting cycle.